Little Legends, Exceptional Men in Black History by Vashti Harrison. Benjamin Banneker, 1731 to 1806, inventor and farmer. Although Benjamin attended school for only a few years before working on his father's farm, he loved to read and study. He became so good at math that people came from all around Maryland to test him with questions. They were amazed at how quickly he answered them. He would ask math questions too, writing them as poems. Benjamin wanted to use his abilities to help people. At 15, he created an irrigation system that kept water flowing to his farm's crops. It was so effective that even during droughts, the Banneker farm flourished. In 1753, he became fascinated with a friend's watch. Watches were rare at the time, and his friend let him borrow it. Benjamin studied the watch and eventually built his own full-size clock, the first built in America. News of Benjamin's clock spread throughout Maryland, and he was approached by George Ellicott, a landowner and amateur astronomer. The two became friends, and George lent Benjamin some of his astronomy equipment and books. Benjamin became obsessed with the stars, lying down outside all night to observe the skies, then going to sleep after dawn. When people saw him in bed during the day, they thought he was lazy. As his knowledge grew, Benjamin even spotted errors in George's books. Around 1791, Benjamin wrote an ephemeris, a chart of the movements of the stars and planets. George's cousin Andrew read it and asked Benjamin to be his assistant for a very special project, surveying and designing land that would become Washington, D.C., the young nation's new capital. Benjamin agreed, and they set to work. When his project with Andrew was over, Benjamin returned home and worked on an almanac, a book about upcoming natural events. He used his writing to speak about the injustice of slavery and defend the humanity and intelligence of Black people. Benjamin was an exceptional scientist and inventor who, through quiet observation and diligent work, helped shape American history. James Armistead Lafayette, circa 1748 to 1830. Revolutionary War spy. Not much is known about James' life before the Revolutionary War. He was born enslaved in Virginia, and his owner, who managed military supplies, taught James to read and write so he could be a better worker. During the war against the British, James heard that any slave who fought for the America's Continental Army would be freed if the Americans won the war. He got his owner's permission to enlist, and in 1781 was assigned to serve under Marquis de Lafayette, a young French aristocrat fighting for the American cause. At first, James used his knowledge of the Virginian landscape to transport messages, but then James and Lafayette had a better idea. James could spy on the British. Posing as a runaway slave, James went to the British camp commanded by Lord Charles Cornwallis. James helped lead troops through the unfamiliar land. No one suspected that he could read and write, so generals and other soldiers talked about their tactics in front of him, and he was given access to British maps and plans. Secretly, he memorized details and reported back to Lafayette. James became so trusted by the British that he was asked to spy on the Americans. He agreed, but gave the British only false information. Equipped with James' accurate information about British troop size, strategies, and morale, the Continental Army defeated the British at Yorktown, effectively ending the war. Imagine Cornwallis' surprise when he entered Lafayette's headquarters to surrender and saw James there. After the war, enslaved people who served as soldiers were freed, but James had not technically been a soldier and he was not freed. He petitioned for his release but was ignored. It wasn't until Lafayette wrote a letter commending James' service that his petition was granted and he was freed in 1787. James took the name Lafayette to honor his commander and friend. He lived the rest of his life as a farmer and family man, secretly one of America's greatest heroes. Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895, orator, abolitionist. Born enslaved on a plantation in Maryland, Frederick was separated from his mother as an infant. He understood that he was seen and treated as property. When he was 8 years old, he was sent to work for Hugh Auld, whose wife taught Frederick how to read. It was illegal for a Black person to read and write, a tactic used to keep the enslaved from advancing. When Hugh found out, he put a stop to their lessons, but Frederick had learned enough to be able to teach himself. One of the first books he owned was a collection of historical speeches. Soon as he learned to read, he was also learning how to give speeches and form an argument, something he would become famous for. As a devout Christian, Frederick didn't understand how slave owners could co-opt the gospel to reinforce ideas of slavery. He tried to escape many times and even tried to forge travel papers. He was found out, labeled a troublemaker, and tortured for it. In 1838, he finally made his escape north. While free, he fought to abolish slavery. In 1841, he spoke at an anti-slavery convention. People were riveted by his eloquence. Northerners didn't understand the experiences of the enslaved, so Frederick published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It became a bestseller. Some didn't believe he wrote it or experienced it, so he wrote a second one, this time naming his slave owners. It was a risky move, and he had to go to the United Kingdom to avoid recapture. There he gave speeches, and two of his supporters negotiated to purchase his freedom back in the United States. He published several anti-slavery newspapers, including the North Star. He took his words of abolition to President Lincoln, advocating for the rights of Black Union soldiers in the Civil War. He also supported women's suffrage. Frederick's lifelong efforts led to the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and he is remembered as one of the most important people in world history. Charles Henry Turner, 1867 to 1923. As a boy, Charles loved bugs. He would spend his days either outside observing insects and animals or indoors reading from his parents' massive library. His mother had been enslaved and instilled in her son the belief that education would lead to a better life. Charles graduated from high school as his class valedictorian and studied biology in college. At the University of Cincinnati, he published studies on birds' brains and invertebrates, becoming the first African American to publish in Science and the Journal of Animal Behavior. Later, he was the first Black person to get a PhD in zoology at the University of Chicago. Throughout his career, Charles struggled, likely because of his race, to find steady work at a college or university where he could conduct his research. He committed himself to fighting for civil rights and advocating for Black students to have a good education. He even dreamed of starting his own school for Black children. While he never did, he eventually settled in St. Louis and taught at the historic Black Sumner High School. Even though Charles didn't have access to the expensive tools and state-of-the-art laboratories that other scientists had, he still developed research methods to make many amazing discoveries about insects. He conducted experiments and determined that bees can see in color. By building mazes, he observed that cockroaches and caterpillars learn by trial and error. He found that ants use light and landmarks to navigate. And he showed that insects have memories and they alter their behavior based on what they remember. Charles was also the first to notice that ants walk around their nests before entering. This action was later named Turner's circling in his honor. By the end of his life, he had published more than 70 research papers and changed the way people viewed insects. Charles valued hard work and knowledge. A pioneer of comparative research, he led by example and forever broadened our understanding of different behaviors in nature. Bass Reeves, 1838 to 1910, Deputy U.S. Marshal. Bass was born enslaved in Arkansas. As a boy, he was made a personal servant to Colonel George Reeves, who allowed Bass to learn to use a shotgun. Bass was so skilled that he even excelled in turkey shooting competitions. When people saw how good he was, they barred him from competing. Bass understood that as an enslaved person, there was no winning for him. George took Bass with him to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Bass was able to escape to the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. He hid until the end of the war, learning the languages and customs of the Seminole, Cherokee, and Creek peoples. It really was the Wild West, a lawless land for miles around. Since tribal courts had no jurisdiction over U.S. citizens, many criminals crossed into Indian Territory to hide out. It was the job of the U.S. Marshals to go in and capture the bad guys. In 1875, when the head of the Marshals needed to appoint his deputies, he thought of Bass, who knew the land, spoke the languages, and was an incredible shot. Bass was one of the first Black deputy U.S. Marshals. It was a dangerous job. In Bass's time, more than 100 marshals were killed in the line of duty. He was never shot, but had a few close calls, including one when the bad guys got his hat. He brought it around 3,000 criminals. Before long, people far and wide knew Bass's reputation, the tough as nails, sharpshooting, 6'2" black deputy. He could shoot with both hands, but Bass chose to shoot only when necessary. Instead, he liked to use disguises and tricks to outsmart the criminals to make an arrest. It wasn't just about bad guys for Bass. He loved animals and went out of his way to stand up against animal cruelty. It's speculated that Bass was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, the fictional masked hero of the Old West. There's no way of knowing for sure, but we do know that Bass was a real-life good guy who fought for justice.